folks here. You were a lively, engaging class, as you can see from the buzzing discussion. People are finding excitement. I can't even talk. Hello! Time to begin, please. It's great to see your engagement and participation. We want to share it a little bit more generally than just one or two, though, please. And we want indeed to encourage discussion and participation. We do not require physical presence. That is, you do not have to be here in class, every class, as is sometimes encouraged or required. On the other hand, we do want eagerly to encourage participation, which can be, if you want to have discussion, to have a friend bring an iPhone, a computer with Skype, and you can talk if you're in Florida or California or Taipei, and ask questions back and forth. And we have done this. This started when there was a bad flu epidemic several years ago, and this was the best solution that we came up with, and students have been very happy not to have people coughing. So if you are feeling at all less than perfect, please stay in California, stay at home, and call in. And you don't have to call in. We will have not necessarily simultaneous, but we will have online on YouTube each session, both video and audio. What we generally do is have it focus more on me and on, if we use the blackboard up this way. We also try to make it a little more interesting. Instead of just having a voice in the background, ask if we can turn around the camera and have you talk. If you don't want to be there, we can deal with that. But in general, it's good to have open discussion with as many people as we can. The books are ordered at the seminary bookstore. In some places it said Barnes & Noble. It's not at Barnes. The books are not at Barnes & Noble, or they haven't been ordered there. Seminary bookstore. They may not be in yet, but the key books are not needed for the first few classes. There may be third or fourth class and later. So don't worry about going there right now. If someone does, and they can tell us when the 3 books are in, we'll spread the word around, please. Other basics. The syllabus is on chalk. It has the multiple options for taking the course. Basically, most of you will take a midterm and a final, and that's it. You can also do discussion postings on Canvas. And those can be, this is the thing which generates the most questions, so I'll try to say, just read the syllabus. There are no rules. You can do a discussion posting of 10 lines, a page, 2 pages, whatever you want on any topic that relates to the course. Fourth, paper. You can do a course paper, which can also be part of a BA, an MA, a PhD, and all of those are fine. We are glad to meet with you individually, 2s or 3s of us. All 3 of us have office hours set right after this class on Monday. So, I think we're a little bit on Monday. And Alan, did you say Wednesday as well?
Yeah, I can do Wednesday.
So Alan as well for Wednesday as his main class. And Sophie has another time listed. Okay, so we're glad to confer on paper themes or anything else we can help with on the course. Any other basics like that anyone wants to raise now before we go on? Although, as I say, most of these are in much more detail in the syllabus. Question?
I don't think the syllabus is live on Canvas.
A little louder?
I don't think the course is live on Canvas.
It's been alive on Canvas for about 2 weeks. I sent an email to, have some of you students found it okay on Canvas or not? Ah, okay. All right, so then maybe I made a mistake. Okay, no, I had thought I sent out an email saying it is alive and I sent you the syllabus. Okay, no, that's bad. So thank you for raising that, but we'll try to get that done quite immediately for sure. Most of the readings and the syllabus are on Canvas. Yeah, if either of you, either Sophie or Alan, see a way to because you're co-teachers of the course. If you maybe I didn't simply we have to make it public. We said you need to say publish. Maybe I didn't publish, but I thought I had. So if you see a way that and you're familiar with the problem, fine. If you're not, but we can wait. We can look at it together. Okay. Most of the actual readings, such as 10 pages from a paper or a book, are on chalk, and you don't need to buy any book to have access to all of those. There are not very many. The syllabus is long. We spent a full year working long and hard, Joseph He and I as the first TA, and this field of globalization is messy. There are lots of people, there's ideology, there are fights, there are little bits of this and that. It's Wall Street, it's neoliberalism, it's exploitation, etc. But to try to build it into social science is what we're trying to do in this course, and to show you some efforts to do this, and to critique those or try to find ways to make the discussion more coherent without ignoring the separate areas of work or the ideologies. How can we deal with that, especially the ideology part? I will not propose any personal perspective the way a few faculty do, saying, this is the way it should be done, or this is the way that it would be best in terms of this. So that, for instance, the economists will talk about the normative economic perspective and then the positive economic perspective. We try to do mostly, in that sense, positive analysis of social science, but we also try to bring in explicitly ideological perspectives which have very different views on human rights, on liberalism, on Wall Street, on capitalism, and so forth, inequality, and many of the other themes which are actively in the general media and social media today. How can we do so? For instance, in the back of one book we have 1, 2, 3, 4 big perspectives. That is, the extreme version of this is that each person is unique. Each head is different. Therefore, there can be no social science or no generalization. We can only do journalism, biography, and non-generalizing history. Okay, a few, but that's generally that's a strong postmodernist perspective. A handful of people still in the humanities strongly follow this, but generally this is passé for the most part. It was a big deal in Paris 20 years ago with Derrida. What we try to do, instead of, if you go from that extreme to the other, there's one right way or there's one perspective or one ideology, we try to say, we don't have an infinite number, but there may be 2, 3, 4, 5 views on what should be done about this issue, or what are the key issues in the debate between the Republicans and the Democrats, or between this candidate and that candidate, and try to list out at least, that is, in the past this was easier. That is, in the mid-19th century, the left and the right of socialism, sort of socialism, Marxism, on the one hand, and the strong market, so-called liberal, Manchester liberal perspective on the other, that got codified in the European left and right parties, and in the U.S. it came in with the New Deal in 1933 with Franklin Roosevelt. So the New Deal, that perspective, the Democratic and Republican Party had fairly clear, strong party programs. These then got more messy after 1968 and in 1989. both in the US and around the world. And so then we get to, but we still have two parties in Washington for sure. But then what we began to talk about with Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and others is the rise of such things as issue specificity. That is, left and right or progressive or conservative mean different things when you shift from the economy to culture to gender roles to human rights or whatever. And those different issue areas have partially their own dynamics. And if you know that a person is progressive on one, you think they're also progressive on the other. Not true. That's the innovation of issue politics and issue specificity, where people no longer fit so well. And this has become much more strong and visible, it became that way, 2016 with Donald Trump, with the using tweets, not only in the campaign, but he's continued it for 3.5 years, whatever, in policy making, of having separate little tweets where some people say he's contradicted himself on the same morning, on the same issue, by saying 3 different things. And in a sense, that's an extension of issue politics carried to an unusual extreme for someone who's president of the United States. Nevertheless, where and how this has emerged, we will trace in the section on, I'll talk about as the new political culture, and then the later extensions of that coming up to present. We'll have 2 main examples we'll often use through 2 or 3 main examples, including the U.S. with Trump. Earlier we had other subtypes within the U.S., especially the more traditional left. But for international purposes, we'll try to talk especially about China. We have two TAs with some Chinese background, and that's great. I've deliberately tried to have TAs from China because China is a much older civilization than the West, because Europe is the past, the US is sort of the present, and Asia is the future. And China is a leading force in Asia today. Third, the theories generally have mostly come from Europe. The big theories in social science are mainly European originated. We've polished them, we've made them better in the US now. But in that sense, the theories are older, especially the big social science theories come from the 19th century. So we're looking for ways to update these. And the biggest way is to say at the end of a discussion or end of a lecture, I've done this now for many years, is to ask a TA, students from China, how would this be different if we were only talking about China? Or if we are talking now about China? And then have another 5, 10, 15-minute discussion. Now, as I say, I've now done that for a long time, and I have learned in the process, I still don't look as Chinese as I have become, but I've learned a lot in the process. Most of all, I would say, in terms of this kind of course, global local can give you more perspective on yourself. Even if you've lived in Topeka, Kansas, and you would go back to Topeka, Kansas and spend the rest of your life there, you can be either a local or you could be cosmopolitan. And people are getting more and more cosmopolitan, not just in Topeka, Kansas, but in small Chinese villages. The World is Flat is a book which elaborates that theme with some striking examples. Or put differently, Claude Lévi-Strauss did a book called Tristes Tropiques, decades back, almost half a century, more than half a century, roughly half a century ago, basically saying the anthropologists have lost their sight, their field sight, because every tribe, every little group in a jungle in the Amazon or in Alaska or wherever is no longer isolated. They're all interpenetrated by television, by tourism, people leave the village, they go shopping at Walmart's 200 miles away, and they come back with a truckload of etc. So these kinds of things. Then what should anthropologists do? Many have shifted to studying other aspects of contemporary society. Different, or they've gone to language and linguistics, or they've gone to cultural analysis. But this partially overlaps with parts of sociology, with parts of political science, and even if you look more closely, parts of economics. We have here in this department, or we had here Gary Becker, who really opened the door to studying everything. I helped get him an appointment in sociology. He was professor of economics and sociology for decades, and he encouraged the development of things like Freakonomics and more, where people write and think and talk about what leads to decreases in crime, how's that related to birth control, how much should you leave in your will to one child versus another, how does love fit with markets, etc. Becker wrote on all of these. And in terms of methodology, people use in economics today all kinds of methodology. So I know a number of you are now from economics, as economics both among the college students but among the faculty as well as among the college students even more is highly diverse. So second big change is life has gotten more consumption so let me back up. Why am I saying this? This course and the idea of studying global changes, such as I'm discussing, crime, ethnic battles, you can study with an example from Venezuela or from Syria with those labels, or you can look at the local area where it is found in even a neighborhood within Paris, within Chicago, and then try to see where and why do we have variations. And if you have, let's say, variations like this within if you have national variations like this, you can have local variations much more like this. That is, you can have a Berkeley, you can have an Austin, you can have a Las Vegas, where people do much more extreme things than they do in New York, Chicago, or LA, or Paris, or London. That is, if you measure them in terms of averages. Partially because there are some extremes, but if you let some people sort themselves out, and this is increasingly happening as people are moving to places where they feel more comfortable. They don't feel they have to work on their land that was their father's and their grandfather's land, and everybody goes and plants the corn and picks the corn and so forth. Instead, children get scholarships, they get jobs elsewhere, they look on the internet, women are often working, women are more independent of their husbands, etc. So we have much more interpenetration. We have a weakening of the family. We have many of these processes going on, but how much they're happening varies more locally than it does if you just take a national average. And so the global, local focus of this course permits us to look more deeply using big data, bigger variations, numbers of potholes in a particular neighborhood compared to other neighborhoods in the same city, etc., in ways that we didn't have data on all kinds of things, from potholes to different kinds of crimes and the like, which have changed over time. One way of putting this is that nations are dinosaurs, cities and local neighborhoods are fruit flies, And if we want to do science, we can learn more from fluke tries of just having a larger number and types of variations and covariations. This is another way of countering or elaborating why did things change from the 19th century. The 19th century, okay, I'm now making a couple of bigger conceptual points, which we'll illustrate throughout the course. One is globalization is multidimensional. So what is global? Many people who'd even taught courses on this and wrote about it in the last 20 years or so, talked about globalization as Wall Street, capitalism, finance, markets. And that is one. That's the first section that we will deal with. We'll go into that in detail from Adam Smith through, including, and then Marx. But any reasonable person sees there is a lot more going on. Just to take one example where we had Latin American countries like Argentina and Brazil 20, 30 years ago got some big loans from the big New York Wall Street banks. Then they did not pay back the loans. So the banks have taken them to court and said, you must pay off the loan. And the people who borrowed the money, the national government or big banks in those countries will say, we're trying to very hard, we're doing our best, but they don't. Okay, so this has gone on for years and years. After a while, Bill Clinton, the Pope, and people in Hollywood got together and said, we should have a humanitarian response. That these were loans made under previous circumstances. There have been new presidents of countries, new leaders have come in. We should forgive the loans and go ahead with other things. Okay, so you have global leaders arguing with each other from two ideological perspectives. You must follow the law, you must repay the loan, you're in violation if you don't, versus human rights, forgiveness, retribution, etc. Okay, these are not unique to this case, and I'm bringing it in because with especially the emergence of new conceptions of, so I'll just sketch a few. If you want to jump forward, you can read the paper by Boschken, B-O-S-H-K-E-N, in the second section or so of the course. He begins to lay out some of these dimensions. But the quick point I'm making generally now is globalization means several different things. And just to list a few of these, it can be markets, it can be political leadership, call it power or other kinds of things. It can be human rights. Just to lay out three kinds of quick examples, and to make the point that each of these are in operation and more. Just add one more here. Technology. The big tech firms, iPads, iPhones, the internet, all of that, social media. All these things have global and local elements, and they influence each other. And these are not just abstractions. Since 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've had in that case Gorbachev, but more generally, Cairo, Kiev, Hong Kong right now, we've had political demonstrations connected actively through high-tech internet, human rights concerns that are discussed, political leadership being challenged, markets being challenged in different ways. And these have led, in several of those half the cases that I mentioned, Cairo, Kiev, to the leader, the president of the country, saying, okay, I give up. This is, take over. You people maybe you can do it better than I could. and with almost no battle. Now, by contrast, we have Syria, we have Libya, and you can have massive civil war that goes on for a long time. But the point, one big theme here as well is there's a big rise of citizens. Citizens have become much more central, active, and engaged than they were, not only in the theories, but in the actions over the last decades. This happens in conjunction with more education, with more income, both of the individual and at the national or the local level. With income and education, people are become more aware of more options. They think of themselves in different ways and see more possibilities. And they can then begin to think of themselves as more choosing instead of just being forced to do this or that. And this is happening even in rural China, where increasingly factories that were there, producing all kinds of things from Apple, cell phones to shoes or whatever, cannot find people to work, at least the way they used to 10 or 20 years ago. So many of the Chinese firms are now contracting out to Indonesia, to Vietnam, to different places, trying to repackage things. But the point is, all around the world, as many citizens are saying, no, I'd rather not be a waiter, that I might feel disrespected if I took a job as a waiter. I'd rather not work. Okay. So a sense of honor. I haven't put in as a separate element there, but that in some societies, some subgroups, a sense of honor is a big deal. What's happening with Iran and Trump right now is related to that for sure. Okay, so big point, multi-causality. First point, multi-dimensionality. Second point, multi-causality. That is, what causes some of these to happen? If we have this aspect of globalization or something else, how much do different factors lead to globalization? And then how do these in turn lead to budgets, citizen participation, etc. And then I'll just for illustration, I'll put an A and a B on here and say, with more data now, we can measure these. Question?
Yeah, can you specify what citizen participation?
Yeah, you'll get this in almost every session. Voting turnout, organized group membership, the changes of the regime in Kiev and in Cairo, that is, these were citizens in the streets demonstrating without having tanks and guns or whatever, which led to a change in the president of the country. I mean, that would never happen, I won't say never, but it virtually never happened 50 years ago. This is new. Yeah?
What about, for example, the student movement, or like the 1968, 1970 student movements and things like that?
No. Yes, I'm completely agreeing. I would say what's happening now is heavily an outgrowth of the 1968 student movement. Yeah. But 60, the two dates I will talk about frequently in this course are 68 and 89. 1968, 1989. Student movements and the Berlin Wall. I mean, because these were major events, but they weren't just a one-time event. We are living with these today. And most of our theories do not incorporate the changes which grew out of those events. And that's what I'm elaborating a little bit now. The main one being, so the first one being multidimensionality, that there are several dimensions of globalization. Second is multi-causality. That is, what are the causes of globalization, and then how in turn does globalization lead to other things? Multi-causality, just a few words. This is to say that in the 19th century, there were many one-factor theories. Markets drove everything, or race drives everything. If you're Italian, or you're Northern European, or you're Middle Eastern, that racial background explained crime, that explained IQ, etc. Even though they didn't have IQs in the 19th century. They made things up. The economy, race, crime, the legal determinism. The law explains everything. You don't need to talk about politics or values or the family. Just read the law. And so some German and French strong legal theorists, fewer in the Anglo-Saxon countries, but the sense that law may be the drivers. Or in other countries, again, less in the US, the state. If you control the state in China or France, this was more classically the case, then you can rebuild the society. So you had the very active states doing this, and then obviously Mao, Hitler, had a sense that we can deeply transform the entire society with a strong enough state linked with a strong political party. Okay, so these were basically one-factor theories. They wouldn't necessarily say everything is there, so Marx would talk about substructure and superstructure, but analyze the substructure as the economy, the economic arrangements, the resources, and then politics, culture, ideas, consumption. Those were just superstructure. They didn't. So at least in the bigger theory, the more general statements of Marx, that was what he said. On the other hand, when he got to Ireland, and he saw that the Irish workers were not joining with the English workers against the capitalists. What did he call that? Famous conceptual innovation that came at that point. He didn't just say they're wrong or it's a mistake. He said this is false consciousness. They haven't read my theory and they're not following it. Therefore, something's wrong in their heads. Okay, they have false consciousness. But the point is that's been used as a concept by many others, not just Marx. But Marx himself was also a journalist. He wrote for the New York newspaper, and he supported himself that way. And he would write about the Irish workers. He wrote about all kinds of things that are not the same as the Communist Manifesto. So Marx was brilliant. He was subtle. He could see all this empirically. But when he was making a more abstract or a more simple, as in Capital, or a more simple as in the Communist Manifesto, he would leave them out. We have the same thing, say, with John Mearsheimer here in international relations. He has a small number of factors. He knows that there's more going on, but he leaves out things which are too complicated. Okay. So the simple point here is there are many different causes that may drive, especially if we remember and combine this with the fact that we have different dimensions of globalization. So tech may be driven heavily by engineering innovations, by materials, new kinds of programming, new kinds of compression of parts that go into phones and driving down the prices, etc. So there's a logic which is partially completely different from these other domains. But when you get to Microsoft and Google lobbying in Washington and making funding decisions and getting data from individuals about what are their rights being violated, then you can have these things crossing in part one another domains. And so the questions then sometimes become trickier about what leads to these different, what are x1, x2, xn here. And as we proceed, these we can look for first simple answers, but usually a simple answer is wrong. So we'll look for simple answers, but we'll usually try then to look at more complicated and subtle variations. And the reason I'm making the point this way is by having local variations, we can see a lot more than, and by going back and forth between the national and we can then say the global, that is, we can have a global average. That is, what's the average number of persons who have an iPhone? We have one number like 27% for the whole world. We may have, at the national level, we can have differences between nations. But we get to the local level and we have much bigger differences. And if we have these kinds of variations, even if we don't study them in detail, if we're conscious of this, we can see how we can understand big international issues. What's the cause of crime? What's the cause of honor and dishonor, etc. Better by having multi-level conceptualization and analysis. That it also similarly, because some of these may be within the head of one person. Some of these may be one person talking to others in their family. Others may be their neighborhood or their city if they live in Bridgeport, the classic political leadership neighborhood of Chicago. Irish Catholic, tough policemen, firemen, who are isolated often from the heavily African-American neighborhoods that are nearby, or the Chinese neighborhood of Chinatown. Each of these are very distinct, and living in one or another of those neighborhoods tends to generate what people here at the University of Chicago have been analyzing and calling local area effects. That is, even if you're the same person in terms of everything in your head, if you grow up and you move back and forth from one neighborhood to another, you can have some local area effects which make you a different person. I've lived, the whole time I've been at the university here, I've never lived in Hyde Park. I've always lived in Bronzeville. And I'm active in civic associations in Bronzeville. And it's exciting, it's different, and I enjoy it. and I enjoy the black culture of which it gives me a part and a sense of distinctiveness that I'm not in Hyde Park 24 hours a day. Okay. So the local area effects tend to shift one's view of many things, including trust, for instance. That is, we will use, I said the U.S., we'll also use Chicago more than most cities because I've been doing an oral history of Chicago since the election of Harold Washington. I started it with Harold Washington's two campaign managers, Jackie and Bill Grimshaw, and we went on for years. So we've got an ongoing series of interviews. I have maybe 100 students who've been here, who are now in government, in foundations, in civic groups, in the city, in neighborhood, in suburbs around in the area. And they come back, they send me questions, they send me assistants or students or whatever, and we help each other out, and I have a sense of how drastically things have changed with our new mayor. Lori Lightfoot is a serious change from the past. But I'm sure it's not far. Okay. The multi-causality, multi-dimensionality. Some key specific cases: U.S., France, China, Chicago. Another general point is that Saskia Sassen, several people talking about globalization, talk about it as a sort of top-down phenomenon. Because we have more high-tech, because we're more connected to others all around the world, that makes us different. The World is Flat is the book that makes this kind of argument. What that leaves out is what's between the global and you and me. And one thing that's in between it, in this sense, it's nations, but also local variations in local governments and civic groups. basically what we will look at in the different sections of the course, and today and on Wednesday I'll give you a little bit of an overview section by section, is we look at strong literatures, area where a lot of work has been done. So the first one is on markets. We have a little bit from Adam Smith. We go on and discuss markets and where and how markets link to global concepts and the like. And then we then ask explicitly, how does globalization change the dynamics in the theories and the models and the research that we have on markets? And we do the same thing in each of the other sections of the course. That is, instead of saying globalization changes everything, as this set of boxes and arrows implies, what we more often do, more realistically, is take something, and so I'll just, for the moment, I'll thrust this out and say, instead of taking globalization, we can have something like citizen participation. And then globalization may, and this is what we call interact. So this is C and D, and this is E, and this is F. C and D are interaction paths. If a bowed arrow with a little circle around it means this is not a cause, it's an interaction. What that says is that globalization can enhance, increase, or suppress the effect of X1 and X2 here. So if income tends to increase citizen participation, more globalization may increase the effects of income even more, especially as we have more education, more income, more globalization. All of these may enhance more citizen participation. And so that's an example of how a more sophisticated causal model is not a direct effect like this, it's a more interactive multi-causal effect. And even if we don't have data to capture and measure precisely the A or the B or the C and the D, at least if we can see this can be done, or let's try to articulate why should that be, we can at least lay out alternative theories in the form of, we can call these propositions, that X leads to CP, leads to take it out over here, leads to another variable, and that this interaction effect can shift how that works. So even if we have no data in a fancy big data sense, we can still talk in these terms and then say, how could we build a research design? If I'm doing a BA, how could I analyze this? And we had several people in that situation last fall, and we can keep talking about it now in this course. All right, so I mentioned the classic left and right and its transformations. I linked this briefly to 1968. We'll pursue this further in conjunction with a section on the new political culture, but I'm just mentioning a few of these themes briefly to give you a flavor of how they may inform multiple sections of the course. And one way, as I'll just in a sentence or two say, we try to tie these together. We try to articulate propositions sort of like this in each of the sections of the course in the syllabus. That is, we try to take this big and messy field and at least say we can't talk about everything, but let's talk about a limited number of things, and let's see how we can do this at the same level of coherence, the same level of quality of ideas, of rigorous formulation, of propositions and coherence of testing, as is normal in that field in the social sciences. So these are in a sense, these are social science fields where there's a big body of research. We're bringing globalization to them, but if those fields have not yet dealt explicitly with globalization, we may have to stay at a more abstract level of saying, well, if we had data on this, it might look like that if we can test the impact of more globalization, as measured, for instance, by having a market in China. So I'll give you one example. Larry Bennett, professor at Loyola, did a study on Cubs Stadium. What was the economic impact of expanding the Cubs Stadium on life? But he studied a small number of bars and restaurants just south of Cubs Stadium. And he then tried to say that is the amount of their revenue increase and the increase in value of their business was X dollars. And many people who do cost-benefit analysis this way will say, we need to know because we want to know if we should give them a subsidy, or if Amazon might come to New York or Chicago, how much should we offer them? And because this was revealed, I think, yesterday, that there was another $1 billion or so the New York State offered to Amazon to come to New York City. Okay, so that is how much, if you are the governor or the mayor, how much does it make sense for you to offer? And to measure that subsidy that you might offer, you need to know how much how many good things will come back if you invest in, say, a sports team or an Amazon. And most of the people who do this do it microscopically. Okay, I know Larry Bennett very well. I said to him, you know, what if people in China watch the Cubs baseball game? Would that be included in your analysis of the benefits? How can we do that? Okay, people in China, when there was a guy who was 7 feet, whatever, who started playing. Do we have one of? Two of you wrote a paper on this last quarter. Anybody think Max here today? No, okay. Two students last quarter, two economics, did a paper on this idea. I threw the idea out, and the two students took it, and they got some numbers. And so they found there was a basketball player in China who was hired by one of the teams in the National Basketball Association. And the first game he played, there were more than twice as many viewers in China than in the entire. There were twice as many Chinese viewers as the entire American population. Okay, if you've got a market that size, that's more important than one little shop selling a couple of beers and hamburgers. Okay, so then, but where does the money go? It probably goes to the team or the team owners. The team owners then, what do they do with the money? That's what makes it complicated, because we don't know exactly where all that money goes. But the point is, if you leave out China in that example, and is China doing what people have talked about? The Chinese economy is an export production economy. They make widgets, they make cell phones, they make shoes, and they send them, they export them to Europe and the US. That's the traditional Chinese economy, the Asian economy. The Japanese did this earlier, the Koreans, etc. China today is rapidly becoming a more and more consumption-driven economy, not a production-driven economy, where watching basketball games is part of Chinese economic and cultural activity. There's very little literature on this, but I've had about 90 visitors from China as they're interested in trying to make sense of this. Okay, so I'm using that one very concrete example to point out the interpenetration across these across these domains, we could break this up and say production and consumption, and that would make explicit that most of the research in business schools, most of the data from the census is all about production. We have very little on the consumption side. But the drivers increasingly, one measure of the U.S. economy is that about 65% of the gross domestic product is is driven by consumer spending, consumer revenue decisions. Where do you buy? So that can be two parts: buying refrigerators or iPhones, and going to bars and restaurants and cafes. That is personal services. The personal services are very hard to export if you're in China. You can't get a hair. Usually you don't fly to Beijing to get your hair cut. But you can import scissors, iPhones, and other things. So the types of global interpenetration, the types of markets vary in their degree of exportability, but in general we have a minimal amount of work on the consumption side, but we're seeing that, but we're therefore trying to take and learn ways, or create ways to reclassify the production data to make them useful for consumption analysis. So, for instance, you can if you have money, or if you have data on the money that people spend on on going to bars, going to cafes, buying new shoes, compared to college tuition or contributions to churches, you can get some kind of a sense of how much the priorities may be shifting over time, and how much they vary from place to place, as there are big variations in these things as if we look. Okay, so I'm sketching a few examples of the specifics, but I'm mostly dealing with generalities today. Let me just tell you about maybe one more specific. Then let's have Q&A. In the the big question is what are the drivers of economic development, of economic growth? And even if we stay with this ostensibly narrow dependent variable, we take this here, say economic development. What drives GDP or a local analog of that? If we build a model like this and we put into it many of the standard variables as we did maybe 10, 15 years ago, and including income, education, occupation, crime, percent, I think we have percent non-white, density, population size, we have 10 things like that, which are frequent. These are the classic things used by urban economists, sociologists, geographers to say what leads to more jobs and what more growth. Or as Marshall put it, land, labor, capital, and management. The factors of production are the classic drivers of economic development. We then, based on some other work, put in arts jobs, the proportion of jobs in the whole area, neighborhood or city or metro area, that were arts jobs, the proportion of the total jobs that were arts jobs. And then we had a couple of measures. We had, I'll just mention that one was sort of a self-actualization, a self-control kind of measure. What did we find? What were the most important drivers of economic development? If you read the Wall Street Journal or Time Magazine or, let's say, Crane's Chicago Business or the financial page of the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune, you'll read about income, education, occupation, crime, black, white, etc. Nobody talks about arts jobs. The number one driver across 45,000 zip codes in the United States was arts jobs. When we first had that, I said, oh, this must be a mistake. But then we've been digging into it, and we've repeated it in different ways for over time changes it. We've just published a paper where we've done this at 6 different levels of income. Is this only in rich neighborhoods? Is it middle income? Is it in poor neighborhoods? It's in all of those. Nobody's found that before and reported it this way. We then have then repeated this with our collaborators in China, in Korea, in France, in Spain, and we found roughly the same kind of thing. This is dynamite. The arts, let me just add one more link to that, which is Robert Putnam has a famous book called Bowling Alone. And building on Tocqueville, he talks about the problems of the basic problem of Western democracy, especially in the US, is citizen participation is going down. People are no longer going to church, they're not joining Lions clubs, they're not in the League of Women Voters. The internet has wiped out that kind of interest. People don't have personal linkages and connections the way they used to. People are bowling alone instead of in teams or with their friends and family and the like. And that this in turn is undermining the whole foundation of legitimate democracy and participation and the like. Okay. He then has a lot of data on organizational membership. And he adds it, he uses the General Social Survey of NORC here and the DDB. It's a survey done by a big market research firm. We got the data, we've analyzed, we're using the same data, and we found that Putnam says nothing about the arts. Did the arts make a difference? He includes them just along with all the other groups, but there's an item in several of these which will say, which of the following groups are you a member of? In a list of maybe 15 groups. Number 1 are tend to be churches and unions. After that, you can have neighborhood associations, Lions Club, a bunch of other things, or arts and culture. Okay, Putnam is right in the sense that membership in all of these is basically going down, except for arts and culture. Why? This is U.S. These memberships have doubled in the U.S. in about 20 years, 25 years. They've tripled in the Netherlands in arts and culture. They're flat in some other countries, and they've gone down in a few countries. But in most of, let's say, the Northern European, Scandinavian, U.S., as well as Korea and some Asian countries, they're substantially up. Again, almost no literature on this, but making sense of it is something we've been spending a lot of time on, and we'll give you some of the results of that in the course. But the idea is to try to join this with the rest, not just to see it as an isolated finding, but to say what is there in people's lives that leads them to pay more attention to arts and culture. And one factor, just to mention one for now to be 19th century, is the rise of consumption. The people are spending more time and more money thinking about the clothes they'll wear, what they'll do when they get out of work. That is, unlike the UFC in Hyde Park where we all work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, most of the rest of the world does not. And many people are happy at the end of 8 hours to punch their time card and go out and enjoy life and do other non-work kinds of things. And even if we may love our work, most people in the world don't love their work quite the way we do, and we need to understand that and to build models which capture the rest of the world outside Hyde Park. Okay, let me stop there and let's have some discussion. And next time I'll have a few more general themes, but also give you a little bit of an overview of some of the specific sections of the course. Questions and comments? Yes?
I was not entirely sure, but kind of wondering if that rise in participation in arts and culture goes along.
Just a little louder. So can you hear him back? That this fan is very noisy. So
yeah,
just
if that rise in citizenship participation in arts and culture, as you said, is observable on a global scale. If that goes along with like a transition towards consumption economies rather than production economies, or if there's like a explanation that you can bring forward for that, or if it's like only an observation at that point.
we're still in the beginning of this. So the frank answer is we don't know. That is, I've mentioned the countries where it's strongest. The Netherlands is 300%. We've gotten that, and I've worked with maybe 10 students who've done papers on something like this. The country where it's strongest in the West is the Netherlands. In the world, using the World Values Survey, the #1 country in the world is Bangladesh. There's more of a growth in the arts and in terms of where people are active. And I had one student from Bangladesh who wrote a paper on this. And why is Bangladesh different from the rest of it? Was part of Greater India. What's the rest different from the rest of India and so forth? He traced it back to the 1920s or so. There was a very tolerant British governor general. And he said, okay, you can protest against English colonialism if you do it in song or in parades or in poetry, but don't, no guns, no violence, nothing openly political. And that led to the the acceptance of a politicized, artistic, singing, marching, dancing, parading, we shall overcome. And so Martin Luther King really brought this kind of thing back to the U.S. and built it into active street activities. But Bangladesh was doing this before Gandhi, and it continues today in ways that I didn't know anything about this. But so the short answer is we've analyzed this a little bit, but it's very much an open question. Also, it's a problem because most of the people who work on the arts are either artists or professors of art or art history or culture, and they're not very interested in doing multidimensional, multi-causal analysis with big data, or even documenting this on a case-by-case basis. So we need all of those to try to unravel this.
I have a question.
Yep.
What about the role of social infrastructure, and we can relate this to the participation towards arts and cultures? Do you feel like that has any relation to the fact that there's an increase in participation and inclusion of that group?
Can't disagree, but tell us a little more about what you have in mind by social infrastructure.
I'm thinking more in line with like the Eric Kleinberg kind of like Palace for the People, type of social infrastructure definition that he says is like places of gathering and where it's kind of under an ideological growth, somewhat.
For sure. I mean, the question is where much and where and how much in what way. I mean, that kind of example, and that specific example, we've studied a fair amount with several of our Chinese visitors, especially Chen Bo from Wuhan, who's been, at their university, they work closely with the Chinese Ministry of Culture. They got lots of money. They do big surveys. 2 summers ago, they did a survey of 80,000 citizens all across China. You don't get that in the U.S. until you wait 15 or 20 years, year after year after year after year of successive funding from NSF if you're lucky. So so China has, among other things, a sense of egalitarianism, that every Chinese citizen should have equal access to the legacy of Chinese culture. And one way of measuring that is to say every county should have a library, Eric Kleinenberg's key example in New York, a museum, and a cultural center for certain kinds of activities, plays or whatever. And so there are roughly 3,000 county districts in China. They have roughly 3,000 libraries and so forth and so forth. We've then analyzed these to see if these tend to lead to more people moving. That is, we don't have lots and lots of data. We got limited data from the Chinese census, but we've been over 20 years gradually getting more from sources, even from the Ministry of Culture kinds of sources like this, when we collaborate properly and work with the collaborators who have access to it. The first finding was, if you look at, say, increase in or changes in income, education, and age cohort migration, such as young people, older people leaving the rural areas or coming to certain more urban counties, does that lead to does having a library, cultural center, or a museum increase or decrease those? Okay. I've told you already what the fallacy is and what we first did, which was, or Harris School or anybody else see the fallacy in what we did the first time around? Or let's say an assistant did the first time around, before we thought this through. We did a regression like this and put in having a library in the county, and we put in income, education, and so forth, and tried to see, does having a library in a county make a difference? The answer was no, it was insignificant. But then we talked this through and we said, but wait. Or no, I guess the reason was we did not realize before that literally every county in China does have a library. So if all of them have libraries, you detect with this research design, that is, including all the counties in China, zero effect. So what did we do? We dug in a little further and we found we also had number of books taken out, budgets of the local library, how many books were borrowed, how many books were borrowed. And for the museums, we had the number of shows, the number of people, and ticket sales, or if they're free, how many people came to the show. That is, we had measures of the activity of these, and when we did that, we found indeed strong effects, significant when we're controlling some of the other standard variables. So I would agree, yes, but you need the right research design to be sure it's not. I mean, I haven't put it up here, but a major concern is spuriousness. If you only study one city, one library, you may misattribute the causality.
It's a weird effect.
Yes. So I'm an advocate, if you will, for that reason, of multiple methods. Every method has its measurement error. There's a limitation in all kinds of data sources, whether it's ethnographic or talking to your friends or big data of various sorts or census or surveys or whatever. They all have their limits, but they also complement each other. And if we can repeat something with different procedures, different national origins initially, we can perhaps get a little more strength to it. Other questions, comments? I hope we will tell you something or say something, provoke you in every class this quarter, that you, in a way that you will hear something you've not heard before in any other class at the USC. And if we don't, we should improve. But that should happen. But we don't mean to do it in an irresponsible, look at this kind of way. We want to do it in a way where we can bring it into the social sciences and say the social sciences are behind the times. We've got new things going on like Chinese basketball fans and libraries in New York and in China that may work in the same way or may work in different ways, but we don't know. We got 10 more minutes, so I mean I've got more I can present, but raise questions. Let's have a little more. Yeah, let's have a little show. How many of you have lived in? Very good. Go. How many of you are basically have more than half of your life outside the U.S.? Okay, that's great. So half of you from outside. How many from Asia? Okay, that's great. How many from Europe? Okay. How many Latin America? Okay. Great. How many from the American South? Okay, that's okay. This is important. That is within the U.S. If you've lived in the South, you can resonate more with people outside the